So welcome, good afternoon. This afternoon we're going to be talking about divorce. And as we all know, sometimes marriages don't go the way that we'd first intended. And I think it's really important to start talking about that more and having more open conversations around what people might want to be considering if they find themselves in that situation. So we're absolutely delighted again to be joining with Vanda from Birkett's law firm, one of our partners, and Vanda's going to be sharing her experiences as a very experienced divorce lawyer. So welcome, Vanda.
Thanks, Frankie. I'm Vanda James. I'm head of Birkett's South East Family Law Team. I've been a solicitor for around 30 years. I'm a trained collaborative lawyer and a member of Resolution. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So I think, as we just said, it's a very difficult conversation sometimes. And a terrifying stat that you just gave was that 1 in 2 marriages actually end up in divorce. So it's really something that people need to be considering and thinking about. Before we delve a little bit more into the kind of financial and legal matters, what sort of things do you think people should be considering if they are thinking that they're heading towards a divorce or going through a divorce? What sort of things from a well-being and personal perspective should they be considering?
Going through a separation and a breakdown of a relationship is tough at any time, and obviously it's not a decision that people take lightly. It's a huge decision, as it is when you first go into a marriage and you never expect it to come to an end. And I think what I found is over the years that I've been doing this, that people tend to come to a decision at different times in the relationship, and so it's unusual in my experience for two people to sort of agree at the same time, actually this isn't working. Usually what you find, one's been thinking about it for quite some time. Occasionally you will get people that say this has come completely out of the blue for one party, and they're absolutely knocked sideways. And I think it's crucial that we remember that, because divorce, separation, if you're in a civil partnership or cohabiting couples, when the relationship ends, whether it needed to end, whether one wanted it to end, or whatever the circumstances are, it's like a bereavement.
Yeah.
And you have to give it the respect and the time and space for people to emotionally come to terms with that. So timing is quite important, I think.
Yeah.
And what I find sometimes, if perhaps the relationship has not been good for a while and one party has perhaps met somebody else, and they can see a new future, they can see a new life, and want everything to go 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And if you try and force it, it often doesn't work. So I think there's got to be some mutual respect in those circumstances, and just allow a bit of time and
let the dust settle a bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then, from a financial considerations, often I'm often having people come talking, speaking to me about what to do. And, I say that the first point from my point of view is taking stock of what you've got. Because from there you can then build a plan as to what's going to be feasible for both parties, particularly if there's children involved. How can you support the children and make sure that both parties are looked after? What advice would you give to anyone who's starting to think about how do we broach those conversations and start to think about the financial considerations of divorce?
I think where children are involved, people often want to make sure that the children are going to be okay, and that financially they're all going to be okay. So I do find that people don't always go to a solicitor in the first instance. They might go to their financial advisor. In relationships where it's been more traditional, quite often one party will have dealt with the finances and the other may not have any idea. So might not know who to go to actually, so
Yeah.
might not have a trusted financial
Yeah,
advisor
yeah,
like
yeah.
yourself. And so divorce lawyers, solicitors, call us what you will, we're always happy, certainly I'm always happy, to have an initial chat, because we're not just there to help when relationships break down, we are also there to explore with an individual whether it really is the end or
Yeah.
whether there's any prospect of reconciliation. I think it's that there's always hope. And so one of the things I explore with clients if I have an initial meeting is, have you been to counselling? Have you thought about speaking to a counsellor,
Yeah.
either separately as an individual or whether you go together as a couple? Some people will say it's beyond that, but they need it for themselves sometimes.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a huge emotionally thing to go through. And so there are divorce coaches now,
Yeah.
something that 5 years ago we didn't see. And it's all just part of having an holistic approach around individuals, because it's not just about bringing the marriage legally to an end and sorting out the financial claims. There's emotion, there's children to be thinking of.
Yeah.
And when couples have got children, when we have children, there's no rule book about how we be a good parent, and equally we don't know how to tell them that their parents are going their separate ways.
Yeah.
And Resolution have some really useful material for parents who are separating.
Amazing.
So if children are involved, I often say to an individual, have a look on the Resolution website. They've got some really handy literature that helps you as a parent thinking about separating and how you and your partner might broach the conversation with your children, because it needs to be a positive message to the children. And they just need to know that they're loved and that their parents will sort it out and they don't need to worry.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to think about, how they feel and kind of making sure that both parties are bridged in the right way. And one thing that I often talk to my clients about is particularly when a settlement's been reached and potentially there's child maintenance payments have been secured and one party's going to be paying another party a set amount, for example. How do you then protect that if, God forbid, something was to happen to the person who is paying that income? And that's where you can consider things like a family income benefit policy that actually protects the child maintenance payments for the period that it's due to be paid, and it gives you that peace of mind and security that those payments will always be there, regardless of if, God forbid, something were to happen to the other individual.
There's two aspects. So when couples reach a settlement agreement, we always, if they're married, we would incorporate it into a court order, and within that court order, we would make sure there is provision that covers the term of either the child maintenance provision, or in circumstances where there's spousal maintenance, we would make sure that there is either an existing life policy to cover in the event of actually income protection if somebody's made redundant, because that can cause issues too. And also the other aspect, which is a little bit technical, is that we would keep open that other part, the spouse's claims, so that in the event that something, in the event of an untimely death, you could make a claim against the estate. That would be a last resort. Really, you would want some protections in terms of life assurance in the order.
And what, do you see a big disparity between people who've kind of planned ahead before? So, maybe they've got in place a prenup and they've already thought about that, compared to those that haven't? What sort of outcome differences have you seen from those two scenarios?
I think the outcomes are hugely different between those that have had a prenuptial agreement and those that haven't. And also because, of course, at the end of a relationship, there's going to be different tensions, and the couple are going to be in a very different place emotionally than they were at the beginning, which is why I always say to couples that think about what if at an early stage, and if there are assets that you might want to protect, think about having a prenuptial agreement, because once you have an agreement, it should, if the relationship breaks down, therefore be much simpler, less costly in terms of having lawyers involved. And emotionally, I just don't think you can put a price on how dreadful actually going to court. If you end up in court, it really should be the last resort. It's not a nice experience. And there are certainly other ways of resolving finances and what happens on the breakdown of marriage without fighting it out in court.
And often people kind of feel concerns potentially, and it can hold them back from getting themselves out of a situation that's not making them happy, because they're concerned about the cost of divorce and getting all of these things in place. You know, obviously it's, you know, a difficult question for you to answer, but, you know, is there a bandwidth or, you know, any commentary that you can give around the costs and reassurance that you can place on that?
In terms of the cost, obviously it varies in every case, because individuals have different financial circumstances. Where a couple are married, the divorce process has now been completely streamlined and it can be done online. So that's the process of bringing the marriage to an end. And I always say to individuals, you can do that yourself. That's where you should save your money, and you can go on, you pay the court fee. The court fee is the same whether you do it yourself or instruct a solicitor. But actually issuing the divorce application is very straightforward. It didn't used to be, it is now, and the reason for that is because it should be simpler for individuals to do it themselves. And that's one area that you really can save your money. Where you shouldn't try and do it yourself is where you've got a financial agreement. Couples think we can work it out ourselves. Great, that's absolutely fine, but it still needs to be incorporated into a court order. And the reason it needs to be incorporated into a court order is to make sure it's legally binding. So that if there are things in the court order that somebody then doesn't subsequently do, you've got a method of enforcement. And so the more couples can agree together, the better. I'm a very big fan of saying to clients, the more you can agree, the less you have to involve lawyers, and that's good for you as a couple and as a family. We must then make sure that it's put into a court order that is then subsequently approved by the court, so that if somebody doesn't do what they should, there's a route to enforce it.
So would it be possible for you to give an example of a scenario where the divorce or the financial order has not been formalised properly, and the impact that this can have?
I can actually think of one scenario where there was an individual who had married a long time ago. It's a relatively short marriage, had then gone on and met somebody else, living together, and hadn't done anything about it. And actually it was a conversation with their financial advisor. He'd changed financial advisors and they were trying to do some tax planning. And of course it came out that he was still married to somebody that he'd not been with for quite some time. His financial advisor had wanted to pass some assets around, couldn't do it with his current partner because he was still married. And so in those circumstances, it was really important to ensure that what they had agreed was then formalised properly. And the risk with leaving it a lot of years is that circumstances can change during that period. And when it comes to enshrining an agreement into a court order, the court looks at individuals' financial circumstances at the time the court is asked to make the order,
Yeah.
not when they might have separated 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so it's important that there's no time limit to make a claim in family proceedings.
Yeah.
And so even where couples agree things amicably, and they do, and that's fantastic, it is still important to have that agreement incorporated into a court order at the time,
Yeah.
just to prevent somebody coming back at a later date and making a further claim.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. And I think one final question from me. What are you kind of, is there a sort of standardised amount that if you've been married for a set period of time, there's a kind of set amount that you might be entitled to get from each other's estate? Does it work in that way? So, you know, sometimes you speak to people and is it like a 50-50 split, or how does that get kind of worked through in the process?
That's a really relevant question right now, because the Law Commission are currently looking at whether what we currently have in England and Wales needs to be changed at all. At the moment, there are a number of factors that we take into account when we're looking at how finances should be divided. And one of the things about English law is that the court has discretion, and the starting point is 50-50 in terms of capital division, but it's just a starting point. It doesn't happen in every case. If it's a needs case, then you can depart from equality. And so one of the things that the Law Commission are looking at the moment, some of our European counterparts have a very rigid system whereby it's exactly how you describe, that when you've been married for a certain period of time, you get perhaps maintenance for this amount of time.
Yeah.
So that they're looking at it as to whether or not there should be some change in what we have, because it's very uncertain for clients.
Yeah.
And every court is different, every judge is different.
Yeah.
And I think what we are moving towards is just providing clients with certainty as to potential outcomes.
Yeah.
And so it's probably not likely to come anytime soon.
Yeah.
Things move quite slowly
Yeah.
with change in legislation. But who knows where we might be in 5 or 10 years' time.
Yeah. Brilliant. Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.